Well, welcome everyone. I'm Ed Gabriel, the president of the American Task Force on Lebanon. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this very special debrief with Samantha Power, the administrator of the USAID. Administrator Power has just returned, as you probably know, from an official visit to Lebanon. And we're honored to host you today. Joining with the administrator from USAID is Eileen Devitt, the mission director, and Andrew Plitt, acting assistant administrator. Welcome, Administrator Power, Andy and Eileen. Let me just say a few words before we turn the mic over to the administrator. Administrator Power was previously U.S. permanent representative to the United Nations during the Obama administration, where she worked, on a whole slew of issues, such as the Ebola epidemic, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the international response to cripple the ISIS financial networks. She also worked on refugee issues and protecting the rights of women and children, and many other issues. And I should say, prior to that, Administrator Power served on the National Security Council and was Senior Staff Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. But she's not only USAID Administrator, but she's the first to serve in the cabinet. It's a cabinet position, first ever that they've given it to USAID Administrator. She's been recognized as Time's 100 most influential people, one of foreign policy's top 100 global thinkers, and Forbes as one of the world's 100 most powerful women. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with the administrator in the past several years when we both participated in a number of events together. And I must say that you, Administrator Power, has always made a conscious effort to engage with the Lebanese American community and leaders of the Arab American community on issues, of particular importance to us. So we're really grateful for this opportunity to continue these conversations with you and let the community hear from you and hopefully interact with you as we go through this hour together. I want to say one other thing, and it was during your last visit to Lebanon that you announced the USAID financial support to Lebanon in the amount of $72 million. This is an amount really that reflects America's leadership in supporting the Lebanese people. But I should also say the United States is in fact the largest donor of humanitarian aid to the country of Lebanon. And this really signals the Biden administration's attention and commitment to Lebanon and its people during this time of crisis. And let me just add also that your visit to Lebanon made the Lebanese people feel that they were not alone in this effort. It was a very important visit, and we thank you. We look forward to hearing from you at length about your visit, and thanks for being with us today. The virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thanks to you for your years and years of work supporting communities across the Middle East. Obviously, on the American Task Force on Lebanon, as well as U.S. Ambassador to Morocco, and as a bridge between government and communities across the country. It's such an important role, and it's frankly becoming ever more important because diaspora support for vulnerable communities, vulnerable countries in this instance, is unfortunately going to become a larger and larger player on the development and the humanitarian scene, as the gap between official governmental resources and what is actually needed on the ground to weather climate shocks or the Putin war or the economic downturn, whatever the next crisis is, that gap has been growing, even as USAID's budget has grown a lot. Actually, it's not keeping up with the needs on the ground in Lebanon or anywhere else. And so, establishing thicker connective tissue between an institution like this one and the community of people who care passionately about the fate of the Lebanese people. That's not a luxury. This is not a nice to do. This is something we have to figure out how to do in a more sustained and impactful way. So open to ideas on that score and follow up as appropriate. You mentioned a couple of people who are on the call, Andy Plitt, who's USAID's Assistant Administrator for the Middle East, and was with me on the trip. Our mission director on the ground there in Lebanon, Eileen Davitt. We spent the time on the ground as well, hand in glove with the ambassador, who many of you know, Ambassador Shea, who's a real leader and somebody I think we're incredibly fortunate to have hustling there, along with our whole team, including our Lebanese staff. As many of you know, more than two-thirds of USAID's workforce overseas are nationals of the countries in which we work. And so, 70% of our workforce in Lebanon are Lebanese, in fact, doing the day-to-day work, some of which I'll describe here. And Ambassador Shea and Eileen just do a great job leading that team. So of course, I wish I could say I come away from this trip upbeat about Lebanon's current situation. It's extremely difficult right now. Having an economic downturn globally, the tail end of a pandemic, we hope the tail end of a pandemic, the blast at the port of Beirut, the war in Ukraine, and then political sclerosis and infighting that has given rise to a presidential vacancy. This is not an auspicious set of circumstances. And I'll just say a word about, even when I arrived in Beirut at the airport, maybe this metaphor will work for you in the way that it kind of moved me. But, when you arrive at Beirut Airport, or at so many airports around the world, you'll see a gold framed portrait or photograph of the president of the country. And certainly, had I traveled to Lebanon in October, I would have seen a portrait or photograph, I don't know what it was, of the then president. But of course, his term expired on October 31st, and there's been no headway made in choosing a successor. So somewhat in a somewhat surreal metaphor, when you disembark and you go into this kind of waiting area, this lounge, there's still the frame, but there's a blank sheet of white paper inside the frame. And so I thought it was somebody's kind of passive aggressive way of making a point, because you could have just taken the frame down, but instead they left it as a reminder, that the political actors have not been able to come together despite the siren level of need across the country for political reform, economic reform, and of course they have to go hand in hand. So throughout my time on the ground, I spoke with communities, and I know many of these are your family members, so I don't have to tell you, but who are enduring shortages of food, water, fuel, the rising prices, the inflation. Some version of that is being experienced in every country, but just off the charts there in Lebanon. And when you drive, I arrived toward the end of the day, and you drive, through some of the bustling neighborhoods of Beirut, just jet black because of electricity rationing and shortages. Teachers have gone on strike, as you well know, to protest poor working conditions, and that's just another blow to Lebanon's students who are already recovering from the pandemic closures that interrupted their education. Waves of frontline health workers have left Lebanon. Some estimates have those as 40% of doctors and 30% of nurses having traveled to neighboring countries. There's a lot of demand, given the immense, inspiring, really, human capital in the country. Human capital reflected as well in the diaspora community, but seeing that community get much, much larger in a hurry is not going to be super helpful, inside Lebanon when institutions need that human capital there. The outbreak of cholera, of course, which is, again, you never thought cholera would come to Lebanon in the modern age, but it's actually rapidly spreading through all 8 governorates. So what are the bright spots? I think the bright spots start with that Human Capital Foundation, just incredibly an incredible resource to be able to tap, as a recovery takes hold, but a lot has to happen for that recovery to take hold. The resilience, what Lebanon and Lebanese have been through. Of course, this is not the first crisis that the people have endured. And I think the diaspora is a comparative advantage, which I'll come back to in a second. So, everybody in the country has been through lots of trials and tribulations over the decades, over the years. The younger generations know of those trials and tribulations from their parents and their grandparents. And there's just that sort of sense of, here we go, like this is the latest. But then there's also a sense of, how did this happen? How do we go from being a middle income country to having, blackouts be the norm and not the exception in terms of electricity, and having basic staples be out of reach, excuse me. So I think that, this resilience you all know well, in leaving the country and building new lives in the United States and elsewhere around the world. You were the embodiment of that resilience, building new and successful lives. It's incredibly impressive. The money being sent home currently, as some of you know, it made up more than 1/3 of Lebanon's 2021 GDP. And so that, again, is an incredibly important foundation for wealth. I will say, as you know better than I do, because I haven't had to try to send money back, but the collapse of the banking sector has made even being supportive and accessing that support on the ground more challenging. It was very heartbreaking talking to our amazing Lebanese USAID staff, who faithfully contributed to pension funds over many, many years. Often our USAID staff work in those roles for 10, 20, some cases 30 years. And to see the worth of those pension funds collapse, almost overnight a couple of years ago, and now be grappling with, okay, now what? And that's, a parochial version of what so many of your loved ones, family members, friends have dealt with. So as the ambassador mentioned, I did announce a range of new funding on the trip, $72 million, as was said. I think it's important to note that both includes resources for Syrian refugees, and the way we've done Syrian refugee support in Lebanon is, when providing that support, making sure that we are channeling support to host communities so that their benefits are understood to accrue, or prioritization is understood to accrue to those who have so generously opened their communities. And I know in the Q&A this will come up again, so we'll have a chance to talk more about the dynamics there with such a large refugee population at such a difficult economic time. But so some of those resources, again, are related, have an emphasis, as we have long had, on where those people are living, often very close to the edge, are, and what those needs are. But the resources also entail actually emergency food assistance for Lebanese. And this is something so unrelated to whether or not a Lebanese family is supporting a Syrian refugee family. The needs are now so acute that we have to expand humanitarian assistance to support Lebanese families themselves. I also announced additional resources to install solar water pumps. And that, I would say, is another bright spot. Necessity is the mother of invention. Seeing communities come forward and ask for this off-grid solar electrification. Any of you who are interested in getting involved in this, I think this is a huge growth area. This crisis could catalyze at a pace, never imagined for the country, much broader electrification. USAID has some resources to support that, but would love to expand the effort that we are making in multiple communities. I announced an additional 22 solar water pump installations. So basically use the solar to get the water flowing. Water has been as erratic as electricity because they're so connected in terms of the delivery systems. But I think we're scratching the surface of how significant that expansion of solar installation could be. It's already off to the races. It's already moving. But I think, for Lebanon to be left in certain ways stronger and more resilient on the back end of this crisis, that is something we should strive for. I mentioned earlier education and the brain drain. We announced an additional $50 million for scholarships and financial aid for students at the American University of Beirut, the Lebanese American University, and Notre Dame University, Louise. Boy, those students, wow. I mean, what an impressive community. I'd actually never been to the American University of Beirut. It's the stuff of legend, and had a very moving trip there, and really sensed a determination among young people to stay the course and to apply the tremendous capabilities that they're deepening at those universities. But I didn't sense a tremendous enthusiasm to go into public service or politics. So that's something we see often, is like a desire to start an NGO or to be an entrepreneur and to contribute in a range of ways. But with the political sector so broken right now, it would be nice also for young people to be drawn into that sector. But that's not something that I have seen in my, again, granted, anecdotal encounters. I met with the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Parliament, of course, extending the message that the U.S. has been sending for a long time about the need to cooperate and the interests of the people of this great country in the very near term, of course, to fill the presidential vacancy, but also to move forward with the IMF reforms. With a caretaker cabinet in place, there's nobody there but those individuals, and so there are steps that can be taken in the here and now, and urging them to go forward and take those steps. And we can get into some of the specifics there. Another bright spot, in addition to human capital, solar electrification that I think can expand dramatically, is the historic maritime boundary agreement between Lebanon and Israel. And there are also, as you know, energy deals that have been proposed by Egypt and Jordan that would significantly restore electricity. But even there, to get those across the finish line, there is a need for effective political leadership. In the maritime agreement, there's proof of concept. There can be compromise in the interests of, in that instance, medium and longer term economic returns. But that is an incredibly important agreement and could unlock significant resources for the citizens of the country. I want to share, just as I wind down here, some of the ways that you can help. So continued investment, needless to say, I'm sure the collapse of the banking sector is taking a toll on that. But again, our efforts, for example, to expand solar energy across Lebanon to rural communities, really, really important. And our partners on the ground are, available for enlistment and consultation to see what more could be done if there's interest there. Our partners on the ground are battling forest fires and rehabilitating forested areas. Lebanon's natural beauty, of course, breathtaking, but the climate importance of doing that as well is significant. Our partners are helping small businesses keep their doors open and keeping staff employed to try to build a foundation for economic recovery. But too often those partners, and again, we can give you a listing of them, are underfunded and could use your help and support. So there's the humanitarian needs, which are now have put Lebanon in a category it never wanted to belong to, or a club it never wanted to belong to, of having to receive humanitarian assistance. But of course, the lifeblood of what we at USAID do is this longer term work that's aimed at building a more stable economic foundation. The organizations that I've mentioned on the ground, sure, they need money and money will translate into impact, but they also, for those of you who aren't in a position to give in those ways, need technical support and spare capacity that many of you can help provide. One urgent need is recruiting doctors abroad to provide telehealth services to Lebanese communities without sufficient access to quality healthcare. And I know that's cumbersome on this side to make happen for people who have day jobs. But now with this crisis is the time, taking advantage of Zoom and how patients generally are getting more comfortable with teleconsultations, all of us are. This is an opportunity to build that infrastructure to make this something that I think could have benefit for all involved. But I'm not pretending it's easy logistically to manage the startup costs, but I think it would be of tremendous benefit over time. If you are working with organizations that are doing valuable, impactful work on the ground, putting them in touch with Eileen and our team on the ground, and again, our Lebanese staff will leap on those engagements, those arrangements, just to see are there synergies that we are not getting that we might get. And those are just a few initial ideas. I'm sure, Ambassador, you have more, but I can't think of a more vibrant diaspora community with which to partner, nor a time, again, to come back to my point at the beginning, where scaling what we're already doing and bringing new partners into that work while extending to sectors, and when I say we, collectively have to be addressed, but USAID may not be resourced at present to be active in those communities. And that's how I felt meeting with the Prime Minister, is the ask list that the government has, and hopefully there'll be transition soon and we'll have permanent officials and ministers in place, goes well beyond what USAID, the largest development humanitarian donor, can do. But even, brokering an exchange of that task list to some in your community who want to be more actively involved, to me, there's our programs, and then there's progress we can make together that may or may not run through USAID, but where we or others at the embassy can help facilitate your involvement. And again, that'll be when we have permanent institutions and leadership, it'll be easier to make those front-end investments because we'll know that we will have enduring partners on the other side. And so, needless to say, I'll just close by urging all of you who have any connections in Lebanon to use your voices to press the political leadership, because it does, back to that portrait, that empty portrait, it does really hurt the efforts to get the country back on a sounder economic foundation, when we can't even say to investors, oh, look, here's the president you can meet with when you get there, or here's a minister who just got put in place and is building their team for the future, but rather where everything just seems in limbo, which is how it feels right now. Okay, back to you, and then thank you all.
Thank you very much, Administrator. Wow, that was a real complete view of what you saw and what you found there. When you leave USAID, we have a job waiting for you to continue this effort that you've outlined. Hopefully we'll make some progress in the meantime with you as administrator. And you're right, I think there's things that USAID has done to seed projects like the solar projects, something we can jump on, and also to facilitate the good works of others from the outside. So our community will jump on all of these ideas. You left so many ideas for me to think about. I have about 10 questions for you, but our box of questions is getting filled up. So I'm going to jump right into some of them for you to answer. Our first person that we've identified here is Manel Saab. Manel, let us know where you're from, what you do, and what's your question. And we need to take her off mute.
There she is. Upside down, sideways, but that's okay. There you are. Okay, unmute. Yes, great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good morning, and thank you, Administrator Powers. I was actually watching you in Lebanon on the various news media and very appreciative of your visit and everything you've done. My question to you is, during a recent trip to Lebanon, many Lebanese expressed their empathy for the suffering Syrian refugees, but were frustrated that the refugees seem to be receiving more aid for schooling, health services, and other support. While such differences were more understandable just a few years ago when Lebanon was more prosperous, with the jump in Lebanon's poverty rate, in this disparity is now more evident. So my question is twofold. First, how can the international community better ensure the host community needs are balanced with the needs and requirements of the refugees? After all, the Lebanese have become refugees within their own homeland. And secondly, should you call for an international study group on what can be done to support the growing refugee crisis in the world? And thank you, Administrator Powers.
Thank you so much. So I'll just come back to a point, maybe just elaborate a little bit on a point I made in the topper, which is that, there are two categories, I would say, of Lebanese that we are very worried about. The first is the one that you alluded to, which is in the very communities where Syrian refugees and Lebanese are living intermingled, there are now growing needs for the Lebanese, which you call, and I call the host communities. And I'll give you one example, one of the areas that I visited, maybe you saw in tracking the visit, where we had just installed a solar pump. I believe the native Lebanese population was around 25,000, and there were 30-something thousand Syrian refugees living in that community. And that is an exceptional example where it's, you literally double the population, the strain on the resources is going to be more than double. And now you have a majority number of Syrians. And so, in choosing that community because unfortunately there's need across Lebanon, we very much took note of vulnerability and water shortages and electricity shortages for sure, but there are a lot of communities in that category. But then also, again, this role that Lebanese have played in hosting Syrians, not as a favor back to them, but rather that placed more strain on water and electricity. And so, in a sense, what I'm saying is that for all of our program areas, we are looking to see where that added burden has been borne, where those resources are exceptionally strained, and then looking to be responsive, recognizing just what many Lebanese communities have gone through in opening those doors. Then separately, and again, I'm sort of repeating a little bit, but they're irrespective of whether a Lebanese family is in a community that is that has a particular concentration of Syrians. There are people now who have, 3/4 of the country has fallen beneath the poverty line. I should have said that in my opening. 3/4 of the population by some measures. That is a startling fact. And so that's where, expanding emergency assistance to Lebanese, which we only started providing that funding assistance to newly vulnerable Lebanese in 2021. And that's very much a result of the economic crisis. So that's part of what I announced in the new funding, but that's on top of pre-existing, hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested, again, in both buckets, the Syrian refugee and host community bucket, and then the Lebanese just vulnerability on it in its own right. So, and I met with, a Lebanese beneficiary of World Food Program funding in a community where, again, there wasn't so much of an overlap with Syrians. And it's the challenge is she's getting a food basket All the food, I should say, or as much as we can, sourced locally, right, to try to get markets up and running by World Food Program. But she couldn't, no matter how, getting a food basket didn't help her get her medicines. And she had a heart condition and just couldn't get, and was like, weeping, just crying, imagining that she was going to leave her kids because she was going to die because she couldn't get access to her medicine. And so, as I tell you what we're doing, I don't want to pretend that we are meeting the full range of needs for folks who are vulnerable, particularly as pharmaceuticals either are unavailable or are now out of reach for ordinary Lebanese. But again, the total of what the United States has provided, as you well know, since 2012, which is now 10 years, but it's $3 billion for this combination of needs. In terms of the conference, I mean, I guess this is just an occasion to drive home a key point. USAID has been the blessed beneficiary of so far 2 very substantial supplemental funding bills that went through Congress last year that came out of the Ukraine war. And of course, Lebanon is a very, very vivid example of a country that has not only paid the price of its own economic and political mismanagement, but has also now paid a compounding price by Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, as 81% of Lebanon's wheat comes from Ukraine, an additional 12% actually from Russia. And so that has further compounded, prices and so forth. But back to Ukraine, by virtue of the war in Ukraine, a bipartisan consensus congealed on the Hill that gave USAID access to an additional, globally, more than $5 billion of new money in humanitarian assistance. It's not enough, crazily. That's on top of our core budget of around the same, but almost doubling our humanitarian assistance budget by virtue of those supplementals, and additional food security money that we are putting to use there as we help Lebanese farmers and livestock, dairy farmers as well, agricultural farmers and dairy farmers get better access to markets, get access to loans that are otherwise inaccessible. We would not have that new money but for these supplementals, and it could not be better time, but it'd be nice to have a lot more of it to be able to fund these farmers and to give them access to lower interest loans, or interest to loans, period, since the banks are kind of off limit. But other countries, weirdly, do not have big supplemental infusions of this magnitude. So USAID is always the largest humanitarian donor on these kinds of issues, and certainly for Syrian refugees and Lebanese communities, we have been for a long time. But the gap between us and other countries is just growing larger and larger. So when you ask, like, should we have a conference? We can have a conference. But the issue is not, are we having too few conferences? The issue is that everybody globally is facing tough economic headwinds, and this congealing that occurred in the US somewhat amazingly that allowed, and we've just submitted another supplemental request for this lame duck period here in the US. That scale of infusion is not happening anywhere else. So instead, what you're seeing is the United Kingdom has actually cut funding, including in the Middle East, but across the board, including health funding, and most countries are fairly static. In the case of the European Union, there has been a plus up, but a lot of those resources have gone to sheltering Ukrainian refugees in Europe. So in the end, it means less for everybody else by and large, and there's some exceptions. But so that's the challenge right now, and that's why this kind of outreach is so important, because we need new players. We need everybody to be doing the equivalent of a supplemental. Like, what did one previously do that one could do, and then what's the plus up on that given the scale of this crisis? And last thing I'll say, and sorry for my long answer, but just, I will just embrace the premise of the question. I think the level of fatigue with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, which would have been, it's been a long time. The war started in 2011. The numbers are enormous. The strains are very, very real. The generosity has been incredibly real as well. But, what you hear like across so many communities is a level of resentment that is and some rhetoric as well. The rhetoric is can be dangerous because we're likely to see, more attacks on Syrian refugees and so forth. But in general, one can also understand in a time of economic crisis where that impatience is coming from. And so the one thing though that can't happen is the government can't shift to a position that some have threatened to, which is to just forcibly expel Syrian refugees. I think there are some, because the circumstances are so hard for Syrians too, who now voluntarily are if they feel that they can do so safely, are choosing to return. It's a trickle compared to the numbers for sure. We are active in ensuring that those conditions are ripe. But the challenge is a number of the people I talked to, one woman, her husband had been tortured and murdered by the regime in in Dara. And, the prospect of her going back and what it would mean for her kids, the son of this individual who was, and there are a lot of stories like that you encounter. And I talked to a number of Syrians and Lebanese about this tension. So, the watchwords are voluntary, safe, and dignified. And given the Assad regime, it's hard to meet those standards, but there will be some parts of Syria where you're going to start to see, I think, a pickup in the flow back.
Administrator, let me just agree with Manal and suggest that we've got to do some thinking out of the box. I think there is an agreement that any repatriation has to be safe, voluntary, and dignified. But maybe we should be working with you and other departments in the United States to look at visa issues, to look at third country issues, to look at how we can even advise through our own work of what the Lebanese government should be doing in terms of worker permits, et cetera. We came back with a lot of creative ideas. And I know the ambassador, who's really on top of this issue, is looking at that as well. So the more we can kind of put our heads together, I think the more the Lebanese people will at least think that, we're thinking as hard as we can while preserving that dignified, safe, and voluntary rule. Thank you, Manal. And the next question is from Nijad Ferris. Nijad, where are you from? What do you do? And what's your question?
Hello.
Hi, Nijad.
Hello, Administrator, and thank you for your service to our country. There's a big effort ad hoc by individual doctors and some organizations here in the States to help in Lebanon. The question is there a way in which Lebanese American medical professionals can volunteer with USAID Beirut to assist the health sector in Lebanon, to strengthen the health sector? And I'm Nijad Faris, Houston, Texas. I'm an investor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So the short answer is we should follow up offline and work to figure out how we can supplement whatever the channels are that are already organically kind of coming together. And you may tell me there is no, that they're not organically coming together. I mean, I met with the health minister, with Prime Minister Makati, and the health minister, this was atop his list of asks, was can the United States government play a role in facilitating telemedical support along the lines of what I described in my opening and you've come back to. So our NGO, the way USAID works sort of these days, like these decades, we shifted to a posture of working, through implementing partners. So the partners that we have on the ground are International Medical Corps and Relief International. Caritas Lebanon also, as you may know, has mobile clinics, and that would be more for sort of short-term visitors, people who would come. And but what I would suggest would be that we would follow up and that out of this conversation, someone from headquarters, Andy may be able to advise who the best person is, with our program officer on the ground, who we've tasked in advance of this call to facilitate follow-up. His name is Nick Vivio. And his email is nvivio@usaid.gov. And the goal there, I think, is like, let's not make the best the enemy of the good. Our role is mainly going to be that of brokering where such brokering is needed. Lebanese are very good at that themselves. So I don't know that USAID's middleman role is going to be, super helpful, short or medium term. But at the very outset, just actually, we have an ask from the Ministry of Health. We have your interest as expressed and probably your knowledge as to what is happening in an ad hoc way. And for Nick to help broker a conversation between you and the ministry about where to create a Google Doc and start to kind of, do that matchmaking and make sure that there's such need with 40% of doctors and 30% of nurses having vacated the country. And I encountered some of this need, directly in talking to Lebanese, vulnerable Lebanese on the ground. So again, just to make sure that those connections are being made, both with the Minister of Health and then with, again, the health partners that we fund on the ground. And then how to take it beyond that and structure it. I think we can punt on that question and just first see what the landscape looks like and how those connections can be made and whether something mutually desired can be agreed upon.
Thank you, Nijad. We've got time for a couple more questions, and we've got a slew of questions in the hopper. Let me offer the fact that we would get these questions, all of them, and try to bring them to your staff, administrator, for answers. So the next question is from Osama Siblani. Osama, tell us where you're from, what you do, and what's your question? And I hope we see your good face, Osama. I know you're from Michigan.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Administrator Power. I read your about your visit to Lebanon, and thank you for what you have been doing and what you're going to do. I read that you are going to increase the USAID by $72 million, helping 650,000 more people in Lebanon, refugees and Lebanese. And that's a great. My question is this. I am an engineer. I'm the publisher of the Arab American News for the last 38 years, but I'm an engineer and I use numbers. So I divided the 72 million by the 650,000. It came out to $110 per person. Now that's the net. The triple net is how much they will get to the individuals, because this is, you have to deduct the operations, the salaries of the people, the rent, the expenses. So I don't know what is the net or triple net, for each individual will be. My question to you is this. I usually worry when first of all, let me say something about the medical issues. We have in our community here in Michigan, a group of people that they are taking medications to Lebanon, especially those who are, that are expensive and they are not available at the pharmacies in Lebanon, especially the cancer medications. And they are taking them regularly to Lebanon and giving them directly to patients, not through any organizations. My question to you is, since corruption is rampant in Lebanon, not only at the highest level, but also at the lower level as well, how do you make sure that when you give them money to the NGOs, we're not making people rich there, but making people help people there? That's really something that I worry about, because I have read that there are some corruptions there, and money has been funneled to people who became rich from our aids and other countries' aids to Lebanon.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the main questions I was asked, even on the ground, needless to say, but because of the level of fatalism and skepticism about politicians and about corruption across the board. I guess I have sort of good news, bad news on this score. The good news is that USAID works, particularly when we talk about this emergency assistance, we are working through trusted international partners. And, you know, I'm not saying that there's nothing to worry about by any stretch. We have very careful vetting and auditing, but these are partners that we have institutional relationships with all around the world, where they have a very, very strong interest in complying with all of the strictures. And it's actually pretty difficult to work with USAID to clear those hurdles, you know, given all the due diligence that we do on the front. So here, for example, as you were running the numbers on the 72,650,000 beneficiaries, that's WFP. And so again, I think the guardrails around providing that support getting not getting pilfered. You know, I think that, you know, they have a very robust system for vulnerability assessments, and again, because our resources are limited, we're going with the most vulnerable, so that's going to be leaving inevitably many people behind, or reaching them, those we do reaching them insufficiently, and not, you know. So I mean, again, I don't want to overstate the breadth of this impact, but nonetheless, you know, those guardrails I think are ones that we have seen guard against what you're worried about as it relates again to these international partners. Now, why is that? Where's the bad news? The bad news is there's more overhead. So your calculation is the wrong calculation, because we are paying for those guardrails. We are paying for that oversight within the organization to guard against waste, fraud, and abuse, and we need to. But it means that the share of the dollar going directly into the food basket is going to be lower than if we could do what you're doing. You were describing your folks doing, just providing medicine, you know, bringing it over there and getting it in hands without overhead. So, you know, whereas when we are operating in places where there's less vulnerability, we are able to work through local partners where the overhead is much lower. And so the larger share of the commitment that we are making is going directly, you know, to the people that we are supporting, or in general, it's just a more cost effective approach. So I'm trying to shift USAID to doing more work with local organizations, but it is that we have to do so in a manner that isn't increasing the risk of that money not reaching its intended beneficiaries. So that's the structural challenge that we are up against. And the NGOs I mentioned, the medical sector, again, they don't have as, you know, they're not these big international organizations, UN agencies like WFP, but they have worked in some very corrupt places, some very dangerous places. And again, we have a good track record of making sure that the money is going to its desired destination. But one slice of that destination is also to the internal checks that those organizations have to guard against fraud and theft.
Thank you, Osama, very much. I just would like to say that, you know, we've got 30 questions that we can't get to today, but I am told on WhatsApp by the USAID staff that we've got the emails of everyone, and we will follow up with them to make sure that we get answers for all of these questions. Administrator, we have time for one last question for you. I'm going to ask Jennifer Meal to identify herself and ask you the final question, but we promise to everyone else that we will be in touch with you to get your questions answered. Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gabriel, and thank you, Ambassador Power, for all your your support for Lebanon. I'm Jennifer Miel, the Executive Director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Lebanon Working Group. We have an active group of companies, multinationals that are invested and looking at new opportunities in Lebanon. We have a very active healthcare group. As you know, Lebanon's healthcare system has traditionally been one of the country's greatest assets, and it's a hub for the region and for the Lebanese diaspora all around the world. And in recent years, as you alluded to, there's this humanitarian health crisis, and access to medicine is a major challenge, primarily because of limited financing. So we're curious if USAID is involved with supporting access to life-saving medicines in Lebanon, or even some more of the more acute cases like cholera outbreak or chronic diseases, including women's health. And is there a role that USAID can help play in the donor community internationally to help address this? So thank you again for your support.
Thank you. So let me, I think this will be the last question. I just want to underscore the ambassador's point that we have a whole team of people who stand ready to get back to you. And if you don't feel like you're getting a kind of crisp response, it's either because, again, we're at some remove because we have to make choices about, you know, which sectors we're resourcing and which we aren't. But please feel free to follow up if you're not getting the specific connection. And again, post-pandemic, our ability to facilitate from North America, from the US, your connection with our Lebanese staff at USAID, or with our mission director, Eileen, and the program officers or others on her team, we can do that in a heartbeat. On this, it's, you know, there's a regulatory dimension to this that is challenging, and so I think rather than weigh in and run afoul of you know, some of the sort of quality control that needs to be in place when it comes to medicines, I think to have a follow-up where you're actually talking to our folks who do our health programming. But I come back to the International Medical Corps and Relief International, as well as the WHO, who I met with. And, you know, USAID, this isn't true in all countries, but we are actually working, you know, with the PHCCs directly, and, you know, working now. I know the French have announced a big donation you might have seen on cholera for vaccines. Again, it won't be enough really to go around, but our funding to the WHO then helps administer those in-kind contributions, you know, if they in fact come in. But I think if I can just put you in touch out of this meeting, and maybe there's like seems like there's a kind of health sub-meeting that could usefully occur with our health folks at the mission on both the telemedicine piece and the pharmaceutical piece. And, you know, again, the shortage of medicines is acute, and cancer medicines and things like that as well. And not just, you know, these you know, emergency ailments like cholera. But I think to get into the specifics of who we are funding, how we are funding them, and then how outsiders can contribute either technical skills and telemedicine consultation in the services space, or you know, tangible medicines through the appropriate channels so that the regulatory issues can be worked through. I think we can take that offline. I did want to mention one other thing, if I might, Ambassador. Well, actually, let me mention two things. One of the things that I was impressed with about how USAID, which I'm privileged to run, but I'm not responsible for the thing I will now praise because it well predated me, but we have a community support program, and that allows us to work in specific municipalities. I mentioned the solar installations that we have done. This isn't responsive per se on the medical, but it's just a general point. And we ask that communities contribute when we fund a full-on solar installation, just to get that kind of buy-in, and recognizing again the corruption and the risks in doing anything in a lot of, you know, in a lot of areas. Because economic times are so tough, in the case of the solar, they were unable to contribute financially in the way that we would have done on prior projects. And so the municipality came forward and donated the land on which then this solar installation was able to occur. And it just opened last month, again, to these rave reviews of actually allowing water to flow regularly for the first time to this community of around 55,000 people in Bekaa Valley. So I think that's an exciting for anybody who's got sort of specific community interest or background. This is renovation, community building, supply of water tanks, solar, agricultural equipment, management of waste and wastewater, which has become so important. And the needs have become so evident with cholera. We also had done a program before called the Building Alliance for Local Advancement Development Investment, the BALADI program.
Yes.
And that was implemented by the Renee Mawad Foundation, a Lebanese NGO. That's kind of closed out, but it because we wind things down in order to start new things, but that is delivering backup electricity, livelihood improvement assistance. We still think there's so much more to be done in the tourism front. Agro processing. I met with one of our agro partners there, where we're trying to help them weather this storm of high fertilizer prices and high input prices, while also, again, positioning Lebanese agriculture to both feed Lebanese and to increase exports over time, notwithstanding the climate challenges that lie ahead. So I just want to put that, just because we're parting, for people to know that we're doing that kind of work at the very, very local level. And then the last thing I'll say, where I don't think really have a current funding relationship, but that I found very moving, is I visited the Lebanese Museum of National History for the first time. I had not been there. And it's an incredibly, for those of you who are Lebanese, I don't have to tell you, but to an outsider, oh my gosh, what a story of how the contents of the museums were preserved over time, the heroism of so many through the Civil War and beyond. But here's a heartbreaking newsflash that some of you may already be aware of, who are more knowledgeable than I am, which is the electricity outages now are placing some of the contents of the museum in jeopardy. So, for example, bronze artifacts, the risk of rusting because temperature is not being adequately controlled. The number of security guards now who can be paid are way down, I think, 10 to 3 or something, an order of magnitude lower. So again, I'm not the world's expert on this, but those of you, I know each of you has your own specific regional interest perhaps, or sectoral interest, but just know that the museum's needs are also as acute as those of many of the other institutions and sectors that we've talked about.
Well, I know about this only because of you. So thank you very much for publicizing that issue. We'll be on top of all these things. Your staff has been WhatsApping me, Feiruz, Saad, and all the folks from Outreach, and they will definitely follow up directly with the participants. We've topped over 38 questions now, so we'll be sure to get them to you. You've been marvelous. Thank you so much, Administrator. And thank you for always being there to talk to the Lebanese and Arab American communities. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador, for facilitating. Thanks to all of you for joining. Sorry, my answers were elaborate and that cut down on the number of questions I could take live, but we will stay on top of this. And again, we can't succeed as a development agency if we don't thicken our partnerships with you, with the Chamber, with very specific investors, with the skill sets that you all can bring virtually, if not in person. So let's just use this as the springboard, to show some returns on this dialogue, concrete returns.
Well, thank you so much for all that you're doing and for your service to the United States, your past service, and for all the president is doing to make sure Lebanon is not forgotten. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thanks. Be well.
See you soon.